Hello there, and good evening. If you'd like to turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 4, that's where will be our jump point as we begin the lesson. As was mentioned this morning, I'll be, fleeing the nation tomorrow around noonish, little noon to 1 is when the flight should be taking off. And that was something that I'm going over there with two other guys. One of them is about a year younger than me. And then the other guy is a freshman in college right now. We know a mutual friend of ours that we all knew from camp growing up. He will be going to, that guy has lived in Sierra Leone in Africa for a few years now. And so he's kind of our connecting point there. And we'll be like being with him and working with him throughout the week, doing some teaching and preaching in the city, and then also probably traveling to some villages around in the area. And then also, this wasn't my idea. It was actually the guy who's a year younger than me. His name's Dylan. He approached me and was like, hey, would you be interested in doing this if we get this together? And I was like, sure. And I asked Quinn and Robert, and they both gave me the okay. And I told him, hey, I got the okay. And he's like, all right, here's some steps we got to go through. And then we all kind of touched base, and all the things fell together. And so now it's suddenly here. And I would appreciate y'all's prayers for wisdom. This is a first for me. My friend Dylan, he's been out of the country a couple times, but and in preaching and teaching. But for me and for the other guy who's a freshman, it'll be our first time ever doing this. So, it's, I guess, first time for everything. But prayers for wisdom, prayers for open doors, and just safety and blessing the work there for the most part. I appreciate that. So, anyways, to begin our lesson tonight, we're taking a little bit of a break from the series that we have been doing. We've been going through why we do these different things and embedding them in the story that we're living into and embedding them in the text. But we're going to just take a break from it tonight, and we'll pick up again once I return from the trip. But tonight I wanted to, this is a sermon that had kind of been on my mind, and the first place where we'll read from in Mark 4 is where this phrase first appears. This idea of having ears to hear is the phrase that, I don't know, it's something that Jesus often ends a parable with. And, let's just begin reading. In Mark chapter 4, starting in verses 1 through 9 here, it says, "And he began to teach again by the sea, and such a very large crowd gathered to him, and he got into the boat in the sea and sat down, and the whole crowd was by the sea on the land. And he was teaching them many things in parables, and was saying to them in his teachings, he said, listen to this. Behold, a sower went out to sow. And it happened when he was sowing that some seed fell by the wayside road, and the birds came and ate it up. And then other seed fell by the rocky ground, and it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, because it had no depth of soil. And after the sun rose, it was scorched, and because it had no root, it withered away. And other seed fell among the thorns. And the thorns came up and choked it, and it yielded no crop. And then other seeds, it fell on the good soil. And they grew up, and they increased, and they were yielding a crop, and a produce, 30, 60, and 100-fold. And he was saying, he who has ears to hear, let him hear." And now it's this phrase that is kind of the inspiration for the lesson, and also the eyes and the ears is what we'll read about in a second. But just that phrase, ears to hear. It's like, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. It's such an interesting phrase because, what else are you supposed to do? And how many here have two ears? Or maybe one, I don't know. I haven't gone around and checked with everyone. But what else are you supposed to do with your ears but to hear something? So what does Jesus mean by this phrase? Well, imagine for a moment that you're a simple man making his way through first century Israel times, or woman, and you hear about this guy named Jesus traveling around, and you've lived your life off the land. You're a farmer, was the average worker during this time, a farmer or fisherman of sorts. And so you go and you go to listen to this traveling teacher named Jesus. And this is what you hear, this parable that we just read. Does it make sense? Do you understand it? Maybe you've heard this parable taught before in a sermon or in a Bible class, but imagine hearing it for the first time. And you're going, and Jesus just says, hey, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. And then he just carries on. He goes into another parable. Like, what would you be thinking? Like, what would you be wondering? How does it relate to your own life experience? Well, first off, the question comes to mind is, can I have ears but not hear? I've mentioned my rebellious days many times from the pulpit as a young lad, and my mom would be telling me something, and then she was like, "Son, are you listening? Like, are you paying attention?" And I'm like, "Yes, I am." And then I immediately do the thing that she told me not to do. There's this home video we have where I'm sitting there on the this little like mantle, and she's recording me and my sister doing something, and then I start like edging over to the side, and I go to touch the light socket or the power socket. She's like, "Andrew, no, stop. And I'm like, stop. And then I just like look at the camera. And then the camera turns off. and I don't know what happened next, but it wasn't good. Like I heard what she said, but did I listen like to what she said? Right? I think there's something about that going on here. What I was described as later on is this is called selective hearing. It's only hearing what I want to hear, or entirely not listening to something that I didn't want to hear. And so the key to this idea of ears to hear is like, are we in tune? Are we listening to what Jesus was saying? And then as I painted that picture of you're someone in the first century hearing this for the first time, notice what happens in the next verses and how it's described. Because in verses 10 through 12 it says, "And when he was alone," that is Jesus, he was speaking to his followers along with the 12, and he began, And when he was alone, his followers along with the 12 apostles began asking him about the parables. And he was saying to them, so notice the distinction there. There's like Jesus' immediate disciples, and then also his closest 12 apostles. But then to the general crowds, he doesn't elaborate as he does here with them in his personal circle. But we get those behind-the-scenes details in these Gospels. Because in Mark chapter 4, verse 11, it says, he was saying to them, he says, "To you has been given the mystery of the kingdom of God, but to those who are on the outside, everything comes in parables." Then notice verse 12, because that's where we get the title of the lesson. It says that while seeing, they may see and not perceive, and while hearing, they may hear and not understand, lest they return and be forgiven. And if you look over just on the other side of the page as well, I forgot to click the thing there. But in verses 33 and 34, there's a similar details given about that. In Mark chapter 4, verse 33, it says, "And with many such parables, he was speaking a word to them, and they were able to hear it," talking about the crowds. And it says, "And he was not speaking to them without a parable, but he was explaining everything privately to his own disciples." So this is just so fascinating, because look at that parable right before those verses 30 through 32. So imagine you hear Jesus is in town, you go and listen to him, and then he just says, "How shall I compare the kingdom of God? Or by what parable shall we present it? It's like a mustard seed, which when sown upon the soil, though it is smallest of all the seeds that are upon the soil, yet when it is sown, it grows up, becomes the largest of all the garden plants, and it forms large branches so that the birds of the air can nest in its shade. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." And then it's just no further elaboration to the crowds. Like, what would you be thinking as you hear that? It's like Jesus, when he speaks in these stories, these parables, it's like leaving a little bit of space for someone to like draw closer in and to try to seek out what he's trying to say. And it's not like, for instance, someone would like walk up to Jesus afterwards and they're like, shake his hand like, "Thank you for that good word on the kingdom there, Jesus." And he's like, "Well, that's why I'm here. Thank you." It's like there was something a little bit of almost like a mystery that he was communicating this way in these parables. And so real quick, we'll talk about the purpose of these parables here, which whenever I first moved here, it was really enjoyable because I picked up where Chuck left off with a lot of his classes, and it was all on the parables. I'd never done like an in-depth study on the parables before, but it was quite enjoyable, so thank you. But it was so interesting because I hadn't never just sat in these, but a lot of the times Mark chapter 4 is helping us understand them. It'll give a parable and then give Jesus' explanation to his disciples. But often it was more like the one we just read. It's just there was a parable, and then Jesus just kind of leaves it with them sometimes, just to think about and to ponder. But what do parables do? Well, parables, first off, they provoke thinking. whenever he's relating to them, he's speaking about things that they know. Like you just look at Mark 4 here. We've read the parable of the sower. It's about growing plants. It's about where you throw seed. That was what their lifestyles were like. And then you keep looking down. He also talks about the parable of the seed in verses 26 through 29. Very short stories, very simple. But they're deep. They're loaded. They're meant to ponder and to walk away and to think about. And then you're like, I think I'll go hear him again tomorrow. And you go back and then you hear Jesus talk about the kingdom and how it's like a tree that grows up and the birds nest in its shade. And you're like, where have I heard that before? Well, that sounds like it's from Daniel chapter 4, verse 12. And you go away and you think about it some more and you come back and it's provoking how to think in the crowds. This is an important distinction I'm trying to draw out here is there are the crowds who would listen and Jesus would just speak to them in parables. And while they had eyes and ears, they might not have seen and heard. But then he explained to his closest circles of followers what these things meant. And then closely associated with that is it creates seekers, is what parables do. Because whenever someone's meditating on this, they're going home and they're thinking about it, it would cause people to seek out Jesus. We have these stories about those who had heard about him and they come to find him and they ask him to heal someone because they know what he's claiming to be by these mysterious parables. They recognize who Jesus is. For instance, there's this amazing story where a centurion whose lord and ruler was Caesar comes to Jesus and he falls down at his feet and he calls Jesus Lord. He says, if you are willing, you can make my servant at home healed. And this great moment of faith, it happens with a Gentile military leader. And Jesus says, I haven't seen such faith even in Israel. That's a guy who saw and heard and was listening, and he could see what was going on with Jesus. And he knew that Jesus had the authority to command even sicknesses, like he commands his soldiers. And then another thing that parables do, which this one's interesting, is it delays the inevitable. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, I've tried to draw everything from Mark here, but there's a number of places we could have gone to look at this. But in Mark chapter 12, this is when Jesus has entered Jerusalem on the last week of his life before he goes to the cross. And in Mark chapter 12, he tells a parable about vine growers. And this one, it's kind of funny because at the end of it, it says that the scribes, the Pharisees, those who were seeking to destroy him, in verse 12, after he tells this parable, it says they were seeking to seize him, and yet they feared the crowd, for they understood that he spoke the parable against them. So they left him and they went away. It's like when Jesus starts acting the most direct in his teachings, it's all the way here when he's ready to die. When his life is nearing its end and he's completing his mission on the earth. For instance, this right before this happens in Mark 12 is that moment where he goes right into the temple and he begins to overturn the tables and he scatters the money changers and he drives all the animals out with a whip. And he describes how they've turned this place into just this wretched hive of thieves and robbers and villainy. And so Jesus, when he's ready to die, is when he starts really going directly. He has right after that, there's all these encounters of when he speaks to the Sadducees and he addresses them directly about the resurrection. And then the Pharisees come with a question, he just knocks them down. And then the scribes come with another question, and he knocks them down. And then he presents them with a question, and then they can't answer. And then they're just angry and they go away and continue to plot his demise and seek an opportunity to kill him. And so in a way, these parables, they create this level of mystery. It's it's hard to pin him down because he's speaking to them in this strange way, only speaking to his private disciples more directly. And so those who are seeking to destroy him can't pin him down on something. It was just very fascinating to me. You can see this happen along the way. And don't get me wrong, there are times where he is direct to them. When he says, you're really good at... There's a moment just a few chapters after Mark 4 where he says, you're great at not following the commandments of God to keep with your traditions, and then just lights into the Pharisees. But for the most part, it's the things like the woes to the scribes and Pharisees where Jesus is just railing their hypocrisy It's in Matthew 23 at the very end of his life, the end of his ministry. And so it does these three things so far: provokes thinking, creates seekers, delays the inevitable. And then fourthly, it exposes the hearts of the hearers. There's this interesting verse in Luke 2, verse 34. Jesus is a baby in this scene, and he's being brought to the temple, and there's this guy named Simeon who's a prophet. He takes Jesus into his arms, and he begins praising God. He's like, my eyes have seen the salvation of the Lord. And then he addresses Mary, and he says, this child will be the cause of rising and falling of many in Israel. And so Jesus' ministry in his life, it's like his teaching exposes those and the way that their heart is. Like to the Pharisees, they become hardened, and they begin to criticize him, and they refuse to believe. And their lack of faith is honestly like shocking and disturbing. But then there's certain people like that. We talked about the centurion, or there's the Syrophoenician woman, or Jairus, who seeks Jesus to heal his daughter. There's these people whose hearts are softened by his message, and they're drawn closer to him. And then if you turn back just a page into Mark chapter 3, or a lot of pages if you went to chapter 12, but in Mark chapter 3, there's a couple of reactions to Jesus that are honestly shocking and surprising. Because it says in verse 20, when he came home, the crowd gathered again, and they could not even eat a meal. And when his own people heard this, they went out to take custody of him, for they were saying, he's lost his senses. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he's possessed by Beelzebub, for he cast out demons by the ruler of the demons. And so these people of his hometown who are familiar with him hear what he's saying and what he's doing with all these miracles, and their reaction is, he's lost his mind. He's going crazy. And then the scribes and those who are from way away, they don't even know Jesus since he was a youth, they say that he has a demon, like he's casting out demons, but they claim that he is possessed by a demon, which just doesn't make any sense. How can, Jesus goes on to criticize that. He says, how can Satan cast out Satan? Like that doesn't even make any logical sense. But with all of these things, it's like this clouding and this mystery of what Jesus is doing and who he is that we actually find throughout Mark. It's actually one of the key details of Mark is Jesus' hiddenness. Like he'll heal someone, and then he'll say, don't tell anybody. And then he'll tell a parable, and he says, this is so they have eyes and they don't see and ears they don't hear. It's all in God's timing that he's doing this. And so now as we carry on through the Gospel of Mark, thinking about this idea of eyes that see and ears that hear, like, what does that look like? Well, we find that even Jesus' closest followers are seemingly blind and deaf at times. Because if you will, turn over to Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8. This is right in the center of Mark's gospel. And in Mark chapter 8, there's this interesting moment in verses 14 through 22. So Jesus here, they've just fed the 5,000 and the 4,000. And he's also, like, if just the story's right before this, you've seen a deaf man hear and a mute speak, and then many more healings. And then there's this moment where they're crossing the sea. And Jesus says to his disciples, we'll start in verse 14. It says, they had forgotten to take bread, and they did not have more than one loaf in the boat with them. And he was giving orders to them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now remember, Jesus has been explaining privately to his disciples the meaning of parables, the meanings of his teachings. And yet, in verse 16, it says, they began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to him, why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? And he says, having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? He's like, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said to him, 12. And he says, when I broke the 7 for the 4,000 with many large baskets full of broken pieces, how many did you pick up? And they said to him, 7. He says, do you not yet understand? Like, do you get it? Do you see it? And it's like sometimes even what our eyes see can be deceiving and we can't trust them. But these guys had this all happening right in front of them, and they don't get it. And Jesus is like, do you not see? But Sorry, I forgot to click it again. That's my bad. Read the very next story, because there's a healing that Jesus is about to do. And you'll notice something interesting about it. In Mark chapter 8, starting again in verse 22, they came to Bethsaida, and they brought to him a blind man and to Jesus, and pleading with him to touch him. And then Jesus, taking the blind man by the hand, brought him out of the village. And after spitting in his eyes and laying his hands on him, he was saying to him, do you see anything? And he looked up and was saying, I see men, but I see them like trees walking around. So what's happening here? Is Jesus not able to heal him? Why is there this two-part to this miracle? Because in verse 25, it says, then again he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently, and he was restored, and he began to see everything clearly. And then there's a part of that mystery. He says he was sent home and saying, don't even enter the village. It's like, don't let anybody know this happened. A little bit of that mystery again. But do you see what happens here? We just read a story about how Jesus' own disciples closest to him, they weren't quite seeing and hearing what was going on. And then now this healing is like a sign healing. Because the apostles are like this blind man. They can see, but they can't see clearly. And then I think this flows, this is going right on into the next story. Because keep reading in verses 27. Jesus again asked them a question. He says to them, who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist. Others say Elijah, but others one of the prophets. And he continued asking them. He said, but who do you say that I am? And then Peter, he says, you're the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're the one who's going to rescue Israel. And then he warned them to tell no one about him. It's again, that same mystery of they make this bold, Peter makes this bold statement, you're the Christ. Jesus says, don't tell anybody this. And then read in verse 31, it says, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And then he says he was stating the matter openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. And he says, but turning around and seeing his disciples, he, that is Jesus, rebuked Peter and said to him, get behind me, Satan, for you're not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. And here is just another example of what we just read about them being confused, about Jesus saying, beware the leaven of the scribes and Pharisees. And then now Peter made that bold confession. Hey, you're the Christ. I can see that. I can hear it by what you're saying. But they don't yet fully see, and they don't yet fully hear. Because when Jesus begins to explain what that means, that he must suffer and die by the hands of the chief priests and the elders, Peter takes him aside and begins to rebuke him. So there's still this like that blind man. Their eyes are still blurry and they can only kind of see, but they're waiting for their eyes. Jesus is waiting to heal them fully and to show them fully who he is. And he even says he was stating the matter openly, but they were not yet ready to hear it. Because Jesus is the Messiah, but it's just he's not like any Messiah that they've ever heard or seen or had taught to them or could even have imagined the way that he was going to rescue and redeem all humanity. And so to wrap this up now, we'll just have 3 points to draw from this. Do we have eyes that see? Do we have ears that hear? What does that mean? Because another way, this is just another example, I'm kind of just giving a bunch of shotgun examples of what it means to have eyes and ears that hear and see. But this is a silly one, but this is just how my mind works, because I'm a very big Star Wars fan. And there's this scene in Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, where Luke, one of the main characters, he's seeking this great Jedi master. He's seeking this master to train him. And when he goes to this planet, all he encounters is this strange little green creature named Yoda, right? And when at first he's like, oh, I'm looking for this great master, you're just a silly little green frog-looking creature. And so what happens, though, is the little green guy says, oh, I know who you're looking for. I'll take you to him. Follow me. So he goes back to the little green guy's hut. And it's only this moment where Luke has to have it spelled out to him that, hey, this is the master that you're looking for. That it's like his eyes are open and he realized, oh, I've been in the presence of the master trainer the whole time. And that's honestly really how Jesus' parables, and I mean, honestly, that's an analogy for the entirety of Scripture. Because anybody from across the spectrum, from an atheist to a flat earther, they usually use the Bible to validate their claims. Like, you can twist the Scriptures into any way that you want, and that's the danger of Jesus and the Bible speaking in this like twilight kind of in-between language, where anyone can come to it and twist it in the way that they want. I mean, example A is, drive up the street. Look at all the different interpretations, all the different churches as you go around. Like, everyone's reading this, but they're coming away with different answers. That's why we need to be vigilant to have eyes that see and ears that hear. Not inserting my own opinion on the text or twisting it to my own circumstances, but letting it transform me and go the other way around. Let it be my master teacher. And that's honestly, that's very much been my personal experience of these stories, especially with those studies on the parables. It's like, I was like, yeah, those are just simple teachings of Jesus that were maybe good stories for when I was in a younger class. But it's they go all the way down. They are deep, deep meditative stories. And Jesus crafted them so that we would keep thinking on them. The whole book of the whole story of Scripture is that way. It always is doing more than you expect and can transform you. So moving straight into the final 3 points here, is whenever we're trying to have eyes that see and ears to hear, we need to make sure that we never assume that we know what Jesus or the Scriptures have to say about blank. It's never you're just well, I'm assuming God's on my side with this. If that's the case, then, well, we do the same thing that caused Israel to go into exile. They're we have the temple of the Lord in our city. We would never be destroyed. It's no, let's make sure we read and we know what's actually here. And we don't shape it to our own opinions. Do we actually hear the difficult things that Jesus has to say? And that's the second point, is hearing the hard teachings of Jesus. Give a read through Matthew 5, 6, and 7. If you're tempted to look at someone, pluck out your eye. Not that that's literal, it's hyperbole, but do we go to those extreme levels? Would I downgrade from an iPhone to a flip phone if this is causing me to stumble? To what extent am I willing to cut off even an arm to keep myself, or to allow myself to enter into the kingdom of heaven? Or love your enemies. Love your enemies? Could Jesus have at least had said, tolerate your enemies? He says love your enemies. And what does that love look like? It's a love that self-sacrifices. Jesus is the ultimate example of that love, because even while we were enemies of him, he died for us. Can we claim that? Can we wear that? Do we bear that challenge? Bear our cross? What are we confronting in our own lives? Facing that darkness and following Christ up the hill to die to ourselves. All of these hard sayings of Jesus, let them rest in your mind and in your heart, and allow them to transform you rather than the other way around. And then third and finally is letting ourselves be surprised by Jesus, by his teachings, by the surprising Messiah in the Gospels. Because Peter was expecting a Messiah that would lead the way and conquer the Roman Empire, and actually what a Messiah does is kill the enemies, not be killed by the enemies. What Jesus did is he was completely upside down from all of that. He was the one who allowed himself to be destroyed and was crucified on behalf of many. And so, in conclusion, do we have eyes to see, ears to hear? Because often what we focus on, Jesus' teachings, we can just focus on what we want it to say, and just allowing that to transform us in our hearts. A silly example of this, because I was thinking about this lesson, and I was trying to figure out a way to also illustrate what it means to have ears to hear, is if, we'll see how this lands, but if I had to ask y'all right now, how many times did I reference the Star Wars trilogy or Star Wars saga in this sermon. I got it one time. Good job, you were listening. Way to go, brother. I was actually alluding to it multiple times throughout the entire thing. Oh, you were nodding. You're tracking with me. I was alluding to references or allusions or quotes from the movies through the whole sermon. And my point in that is this. It's not my own cleverness. There wasn't any hidden details in that. You can go back and listen. But is that if you don't have ears to hear it, you weren't going to hear it. But if you were saturated in the Star Wars lore or movies or whatever, you would hear those random references and quotes. And I hope that doesn't seem too silly, but often we can sit here and we can read and we can listen to what Jesus says and be completely deaf to what he's trying to tell us if we don't have ears to hear. And that was my only silly example from that. But the other thing that it invokes is for us to go back and to reread and to re-listen to what he has to say. Because as we're transformed by it, new things will begin to pop out as we read through his teachings and through this whole story. It's living and it's powerful. And it's transforming our lives and our minds today. But now is the time that we extend the invitation. And if there's anyone here tonight who maybe this is your first time hearing about Jesus, about his life, or maybe you've heard it 1,000 times, but you were not listening until you act on it. Because that's what hearing his words is when we truly see and hear who Jesus is, we act on it. So if there's anyone here this evening who needs to respond to his call, needs to become a Christian, would you please come now? If there's anyone who has been a Christian, you were listening to him, you did see who he was, yet you've turned aside and wandered away,